Okay, now let's take a closer look at the interface and some ways to personalize Cubase. In this chapter, you'll learn how to use the window layout tool, configure tracks and toolbars, set up the ruler, use advanced navigation and zoom tools, set up the key commands, and use preferences. Now let's open up the rest of the project window. So go ahead and click on the window layout tool, which is a fairly simple tool, but it's a real lifesaver. Just click on what you want to show and then click in the green area to hide it. Let's look at the toolbar. Lots of horizontal rows at the top of the screen. And the toolbar has some really obvious stuff like transport controls and then some other really obscure stuff. After you get comfortable with the program, you can customize this by right-clicking on it. Now, there's also a stripped-down version of this called the toolbox, which you can call up anywhere in the project window with a right-click. Now, this keeps you from having to mouse all the way back up to the top each time you want to change controls. Next up is the status line, and this gives you the name, rank, and serial number information about your project. Handy to have in view at some times and easy to hide if you don't want it. One thing, if you ever see the record format up here in red, there's a problem. That means that something in your project is in a different format than everything else. So you need to check the sample rates for all your clips to find the troublemaker. And you can do that by opening the pool. The next row here is called the info line. It's kind of the same idea, but this is the name, rank, and serial number about whatever part you currently have in focus. Now, most of the time, this is just nice to know stuff. But you can click into these fields and edit them. And this is really handy for setting start points. It's just easier to click in here and type the bar rather than drag to it. If you have a lot of stuff selected at once, you'll see different colors up here as a heads up. This is the overview line, and it's for navigating your project, and it works like a super ruler. You can see your tracks as tiny rectangles, and the lighter area is what you're seeing in the project window. And you can drag that to scroll around. And you can stretch it out to zoom. Now, after you do it a little, this is actually a lot faster than scroll bars and jog wheels. Next is the ruler, and some people call this the timeline. The start is on the left, end is on the right, and you can right-click to switch between all these different types of time displays. And doing this won't affect your project's content, just how it's measured. When you're in certain warp modes, the ruler here turns a lovely shade of burnt umber, and we'll see that in a little bit. Now, one thing that will trip you up is switching the ruler formats with the snap function engaged. And that's because snap uses the ruler for its guidance. So sometimes I'll be building a track in bars and beats and everything is snapping to the next bar just fine. But if I switch the ruler over to linear time, to see how long the song is going to be, and then I start moving stuff, it no longer snaps right. It snaps to the linear timeline, not to the next bar, and nothing wants to line up. But if I put the ruler back into bars and beats, then the snap works just fine. Now, you can also zoom by clicking on the ruler and dragging up and down. Personally, I find this a little twitchy, but some folks really love it. The new MEMZAP feature is probably a more efficient way to zoom between different levels. The most important part of the ruler are these white triangles called locators. They define the beginning and end of your project. Cubase only exports what's between the two locators. So remember that if you have the locators surrounding just a chorus or a verse because you're cycle recording or punching in and punching out maybe, and then you go to export the mix without repositioning the locators, Cubase will only export that one section. You set the locators by clicking and dragging, or by pressing Command plus the number pad 1, and Command the number pad 2. And if you ever accidentally transpose the left and right locator, the area in between changes from blue to red. This area to the left is known as the inspector, and it's one of the most important areas in Cubase. The inspector's functions are located on these nested tabs. You click a tab to open it, and click it again to close it. Now, each track in your project has its own inspector, and as you select different tracks, the inspector automatically changes to match the selected track. The top tab contains the most basic information like name, volume, signal routing. And we'll explore all of these various functions later on. You can customize what's shown in the inspector by right-clicking on any tab. This area right next to the inspector also has a name. It's called the track list, but I had to dig really hard to find that. It shows all of the various tracks in your project, their names, their controls, and so forth. And you can customize these controls by right-clicking on any track in the list. This calls up the track control dialog, and you can make several different kinds of adjustments. First, using the black drop-down menu, you can select which type of track you're configuring. Then you can choose the controls that are going to be visible and hidden. Normally, the track controls will reposition themselves as you resize the track list, which is called control wrapping. And this keeps all of the controls in view at all times, or most of them anyway. But you can group certain controls so they always display next to each other. Select what you want and click Group. Now, you might also want to disable control wrapping, especially if you're working with students or interns, or you're just new to Cubase and you don't want buttons moving around. To do this, just simply uncheck the Wrap Controls option. The main area here is called the Event Display, and this is where you do a lot of editing and navigation. Now, there are standard scroll bars to control position, and there's a standard window sizing tool. You also have these triangular controls that allow you to adjust track height and waveform height and the various zooms. But a better way to do that is with zoom presets. Now, obviously, these allow you to jump quickly between different resolutions. The very best way to do this is with key commands. Now, key commands will speed up your workflow more than anything else. And people who study this say that using key commands makes you about 400% faster than using a mouse. Key commands are stored globally, so the settings we adjust here will be available to all our projects. Select the action that you want from the column on the left. You can use the search function to help you find it. Place your cursor in the box labeled Type in Key and type in the key you want mapped. Then click Assign. The key we just set now shows up in the list. You can also have one action assigned to several key commands. Here are 3 key commands that I recommend you set up. Zoom to full, zoom to preset 4, which zooms into about 10 seconds, and clear all meters. And I recommend that you assign that to the escape key. Now, when you're setting up key commands, try to use odd or rarely used keys. If you assign zoom out to the F key, every time you typed an F key, your project would zoom all the way out. The project setup dialog is easy to overlook, but it contains a lot of important information, and it's under the project menu. This is where you establish your digital credentials. You can set up the sample rate, bit depth, frame rate, all that stuff. The project setup dialog also lets you specify what format you want your audio in. And finally, let's take a quick look at preferences. Now, this is found under the Cubase or File menu. Preferences are also stored globally, so any changes we make here affect Cubase system-wide. It's a straightforward interface. Select the item that you want to adjust on the left and make the adjustments on the right. So let's go through one example together. Now, Cubase has a default setting that automatically arms any track you select. Well, that's okay if you're working alone, but if you're recording others, it can cause real problems. For example, if you're recording track 2 and you try to adjust track 1, the moment you select track 1, it will arm and track 2 will disarm. So to fix this, disable the option to record enable on selected track. Now you can make adjustments safely during the recording process. However, now you've got to remember to manually arm and disarm your tracks. So it's a trade-off, which is why they call this preferences. Finally, after you have all your preferences configured, save them. When you call tech support, especially with a Mac, the first thing they're going to have you do is trash your preferences file. And all kidding aside, if you're having problems on a Mac, 50% of the time this really will solve it. Trash the preferences file for whatever program is giving you fits, then restart the Mac and relaunch the program, and you're probably good to go. Then in Cubase, you can simply reload your personalized preferences. Updates and upgrades will sometimes reset all of the preferences to the factory defaults as well. So If you save your preferences, you can simply reload them instead of having to rebuild them one at a time. Okay, let's move on to Chapter 3 and we'll get into audio editing.